In the unforgiving territories of the American West, a person's worth was often measured by how well they fit the mold. For a man, it was the strength in his back and the speed of his draw. For a woman, it was her grace, her piety, and her ability to be a dutiful, unassuming wife. But what happened when a woman didn't fit? When she towered over every suitor, her very presence a challenge to the fragile pride of small men. This is the story of Alina Foster, a woman mocked for her height, a woman they said was built too grand for any man's home. They were right. No ordinary man's home would do. It would take a giant to build one for her. The dust of Arizona in 1878 had a taste. It was a fine, gritty powder that coated the tongue, settled in the lungs, and clung to every hope until it too turned a dull, lifeless brown. For Alina Foster, the taste was the flavor of her life. She had known it since she was 15, when a late growth spurt shot her past every girl and then every boy in Dust Devil Creek. Now at 22, she stood a shade under 6 feet tall, a human sundial, casting a long, lonely shadow over the town's boardwalks. Her height was not a gentle, willowy elegance. It was a solid, corn-fed sturdiness with broad shoulders from hauling water and hands that were more accustomed to mending fences than delicate needlework. In a place where women were meant to be petite flowers, Alina was a towering saguaro cactus, prickly imposing, and left very much alone. She lived with her aunt and Uncle Mary and Thomas Patton, who had taken her in after her parents succumbed to cholera years ago. They were not cruel people, but they were weary. Thomas was a wiry blacksmith with a perpetual stoop, and Mary was a woman worn smooth by hardship, her face a roadmap of worries. Alina was another worry, a large, unmarriable one. "You slouch, child," Mary would sigh, watching Alina duck instinctively through the low doorway of their cramped adobe home. A lady holds her shoulders back. "If I hold my shoulders back, I'll take the doorframe with me." Alina would reply, her voice, a low contralto, that lacked the desired feminine lilt. The mockery wasn't always overt. It was in the hastily averted eyes of the men who gathered outside the saloon, the snickering whispers of the married women by the dry goods store the way children would sometimes walk on their tiptoes behind her laughing until a parent shushed them. It was 1,000 tiny cuts that had over 7 years bled her spirit dry. The epicenter of her humiliation was the church and its self-appointed social arbiter, Martha Higgins. The preacher's wife, a woman as small and sharp as a sewing needle, saw Alina's height as a personal affront to God's natural order. "It's a pity," Martha would say, her voice carrying across the pews in the moments before the sermon. Such a strong back for labor. But what man wants a wife he has to look up to? It's unnatural. The worst of the tormentors, however, was Andrew Croft. He was the son of Bartholomew Croft, the wealthiest rancher in the county, and he wore his privilege like a shiny buckle. He was handsome in a cruel sort of way, with a confident smirk that never reached his cold blue eyes. Andrew had decided early on that Alina's existence was his personal entertainment. He never missed an opportunity for a public jibe. The annual Founders' Day social was the event that broke something inside her. It was held in the new, half-finished town hall, the biggest open space in Dust Devil Creek. Lanterns were strung from the rafters, a fiddler sawed away in the corner, and the air was thick with the smell of sweat, cheap perfume, and desperation. The unmarried women of the town lined one wall, fanning themselves, while the bachelors and widowers sized them up from across the floor like cattle at auction. Alina stood at the very end of the line, trying to melt into the rough-hewn timber wall. She wore her best dress, a simple calico her aunt had helped her make. They'd had to buy extra fabric for the length, a fact that had not gone unnoticed by the clerk at the mercantile. Despite her efforts, she felt like a giraffe in a pen of chickens. Andrew Croft, 3 whiskies deep and twice as arrogant, made his way down the line of men, his voice booming. "Well now, boys, look at the prospects. There's little Lucy Miller, sweet as a peach, and Rebecca May, a fine cook, I hear." But what about the grand prize? He stopped and pointed directly at Alina. The fiddler faltered. The chatter died down. Every eye in the room swiveled to her. "Look at that Miss Alina Foster." He sauntered closer, circling her as if she were a strange monument. A man wouldn't need a ladder to fix his roof with a wife like that. Just have her stand on the porch. A wave of cruel laughter rippled through the hall. Some men guffawed loudly. Others hid their snorts behind their hands. The women tittered a mixture of pity and relief that they were not the target. Alina felt a hot, prickling shame crawl up her neck, her face burning as if she'd been slapped. She could feel her Aunt Mary's horrified gaze from across the room. Andrew leaned in his voice, dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was still loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Tell me, Alina, when you finally rope a husband, where will you find a bed long enough? Or will you just make the poor fella sleep, curled up at your feet like a dog?" The laughter erupted again, louder this time. It crashed over Alina in a wave of sound, drowning her. She couldn't breathe. Her vision swam. She saw nothing but a sea of mocking faces, teeth bared in amusement at her expense. She didn't run. Running would have been a spectacle, and she had given them enough of that. With a rigidity that she prayed looked like dignity, she turned, pushed past the edge of the crowd, and walked out of the town hall. She did not duck under the doorway. The sharp crack of her head against the lintel was a welcome grounding pain. It was real physical something to focus on besides the shattering of her spirit. She didn't go home. She walked past the livery, past the last glowing windows of the saloon, and out into the vast, indifferent darkness of the desert. The moon was a merciless silver coin illuminating the stark landscape. She walked until the sounds of the town faded, replaced by the yip of a distant coyote and the whisper of the wind through sagebrush. She finally stopped at the edge of a dry arroyo, her breath coming in ragged sobs. She sank to her knees, the sharp rocks digging into her skin, and she wept. She wept for the girl she had been, and the woman she couldn't seem to become. She wept for the loneliness that was a physical ache in her chest, a hollow space that no amount of food or work could fill. Why, she whispered to the unblinking stars, "Why did you make me this way?" The desert offered no answer. In Dust Devil Creek, a woman's worth was her suitability as a wife. Tonight, the town had passed its final judgment. She was worthless. And as she knelt there, a tall, solitary figure, shrouded in moonlight and despair, Alina Foster believed them. A week after the Founders' Day social, a new shadow fell over Dust Devil Creek. It belonged to a man who made Alina Foster look merely tall. He rode into town, not on a horse, but walking beside a weary-looking mule, laden with tools and a heavy canvas roll. He was immense, well over 6.5 feet, with shoulders as broad as an axe handle is long. His skin was the color of rich, sun-baked earth, and a long, thick braid of jet-black hair hung down his back. His face was a landscape of its own, with a strong jaw, a nose that had been broken at least once, and dark, deep-set eyes that seemed to miss nothing and reveal less. He moved with a quiet, deliberate economy that was at odds with his size. There was no swagger, no bravado. He simply was, and his presence was as solid and undeniable as the granite mesas that bordered the valley. The town fell silent as he passed. Men stopped their whittling, women pulled their children closer. They saw the high cheekbones, the cast of his features, and the name was whispered from the saloon porch to the mercantile. Cherokee. He walked to the blacksmith's shop, his footsteps soft on the dusty street. Thomas Patton Alina's uncle looked up from his anvil, his eyes widening slightly. The giant didn't speak right away. He ran a hand large enough to palm a melon over the mule's flank. Then he looked at Thomas, his gaze steady. "Need shoes for the mule," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. "And I need to water her. Name's Noah." He offered no surname. In the West, that wasn't uncommon, but for a man who so clearly bore the heritage of the tribes the settlers both feared and reviled, it was a stark statement. He was who he was. Nothing more needed saying. Thomas, a man who judged others by the calluses on their hands rather than the color of their skin, simply nodded. "I can do that. Water troughs yonder." "Cost you 4 bits." Noah reached into a leather pouch at his belt and produced the coins. The transaction was simple business-like, but the rest of the town watched with bated breath as if expecting violence to erupt at any moment. Andrew Croft and 2 of his ranch hands stood on the boardwalk opposite, arms crossed, watching Noah with open hostility. Alina was inside her uncle's house, kneading bread when she saw him. She looked through the small kitchen window and froze her hands buried in the dough. For the first time in her life, she was looking at a man who was significantly taller than her. It was a strange, unsettling feeling. He wasn't just tall. He was built on a different scale, like a character from a myth. As he led his mule to the trough, he moved with a grace that defied his bulk. She saw Andrew watching him, a sneer on his face, and felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. Noah worked with her uncle to shoe the mule his movements efficient and strong. He spoke little, answering Thomas's questions with short, direct answers. He was a builder, he said, looking for a place to winter. No, he wasn't looking for trouble. Trouble, however, was looking for him. As he finished ready to leave, Andrew Croft and his men swaggered across the street. Well, Andrew drawled, stopping directly in Noah's path. "Look what the trail coughed up." You lost Chief Noah's expression, didn't change. His dark eyes rested on Andrew, calm and unreadable. He simply stood there, a mountain of a man waiting. His silence was more unnerving than any threat. "Cat got your tongue," Andrew taunted, stepping closer. He was a tall man himself, but he had to crane his neck to look up at Noah. "We don't take kindly to your sort around here. Best you keep moving." Noah shifted his weight slightly. It was the only movement he made, but it was enough. It was a promise of immense, coiled power. "I'm just passing through," he said, his voice still a low rumble. "See that you do." Andrew spat, angered by the man's refusal to be intimidated. He gestured at Alina's uncle. "And you, Patton, you be careful who you do business with. Stinks up the whole town." Before Thomas could reply, the back door of the house creaked open. Alina stepped out, holding a bucket of scraps for the chickens. She hadn't meant to intervene, but she couldn't stand by and listen to her uncle be insulted. Her sudden appearance, tall and unexpected, drew every eye. For a moment there was a strange tableau in the dusty yard. The towering, silent Cherokee man, the arrogant rancher's son, and the woman who was too tall for the town. Andrew's sneer faltered for a second, seeing the 2 of them in the same space. It was a freak show, his expression seemed to say. He recovered quickly, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Well, look at this. Maybe he's not lost after all. Maybe he's come calling on our own giantess. You 2 could build a nest on a treetop, the ranch." Hands cackled. Alina flushed with the familiar, sickening heat of shame. But this time something else mingled with it: anger. Pure, hot anger. She looked from Andrew's mocking face to Noah's impassive one. His eyes flickered to hers for a fraction of a second. There was no pity in them, no amusement. There was only acknowledgement. It was the look of one outsider recognizing another. Noah turned his gaze back to Andrew. He took one slow step forward. Andrew and his men instinctively shuffled back. "I've paid for my business," Noah said, his voice flat and cold as river stone. "I'll be on my way." He turned, not waiting for a response, gathered the mule's lead, and walked away, his back straight and broad. He didn't look back. Andrew, robbed of his confrontation, was left fuming in the yard. He shot a venomous glare at Alina before stomping off toward the saloon with his men. Alina stood frozen, the bucket handle digging into her fingers. The brief shared glance with the stranger had unsettled her more than Andrew's taunts. In that fleeting moment, she had not felt like a freak. She had simply felt seen. 2 days later, the circuit lawyer Mr. Abernathy rode into town, bringing with him a twist of fate Alina could never have predicted. He sought her out at the blacksmith's shop, a dusty satchel full of papers in his hand. "Miss Alina Foster?" he asked, peering at her over his spectacles. "Yes, sir. I bring you news. It concerns the estate of your great-aunt, Sadie Finch. I believe you met her once as a small child." Alina vaguely remembered a stern, reclusive old woman who had lived alone miles out of town. "She passed on 2 months ago," Abernathy continued, pulling out a deed. "She had no other living relatives. In her will, she left you her property. It's not much, I'm afraid. 30 acres of rock and scrub about 5 miles north of here. The cabin on it collapsed years ago. Most folks consider the land worthless." He coughed apologetically. "But it is yours. All legal and filed with the territorial office." He handed her the deed. She took it, her fingers tracing the spidery script of her own name. Alina Foster, owner. It was a strange and powerful word. Worthless or not, it was hers. Her aunt and uncle were relieved. It was a problem off their hands, a place for her to go. To them it was a polite form of exile. But to Alina, holding that piece of paper, a wild, impossible idea began to take root. A house, a place of her own. A home with doors she wouldn't have to duck through and ceilings that wouldn't press down on her. A place where she wouldn't be a burden or a spectacle. The idea was madness. She had no money, no skills in building. The land was considered useless. It was a fool's dream. But it was her fool's dream. And as she stood there, clutching the deed to 30 acres of rock and scrub, she remembered the silent giant named Noah. The builder, the other outsider. And the seed of that impossible idea began to sprout. The first week on her own land was a lesson in humility. Alina used her uncle's old wagon to haul her meager possessions, a bedroll, a few pots, a sack of flour, and an axe to the property. The land was exactly as Mr. Abernathy had described, a harsh, unyielding swath of the Arizona territory. Jagged rock formations jutted from the earth like broken teeth, and the ground was choked with creosote mesquite and thorny ocotillo. The ruins of her great-aunt's cabin were little more than a pile of rotting timbers and crumbled adobe already being reclaimed by the desert. Her dream of a house seemed not just foolish, but delusional. The sun was a merciless hammer. The work was brutal. She spent days trying to clear a small patch of ground, her hands quickly blistering and then bleeding. She tried to quarry stone from a nearby outcrop, but the heavy sledgehammer seemed to bounce off the rock, jarring her bones and accomplishing little. Each night she'd collapse by her small campfire, exhausted, sore, and enveloped by a silence so profound it felt like a weight. The loneliness out here was different from the loneliness in town. It wasn't born of mockery, but of pure, crushing isolation. On the 5th day, as she struggled to drag a heavy timber from the collapsed cabin, she saw a figure approaching from the direction of the road. It was Noah. He moved with that same silent, ground-covering stride, his mule trailing behind him. He stopped at the edge of the clearing she'd fought so hard to make and simply watched. Alina stopped wiping sweat and dust from her brow with the back of a raw hand. She felt a flush of embarrassment. He was a builder. He must see the pitiful amateurishness of her efforts. "It's my land," she said, her voice defensive. Noah nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the terrain, the pile of ruins, her failed attempts at quarrying. He wasn't looking at her, but at the task. He walked over to the rock face she'd been attacking. He ran his enormous hand over the stone, tracing a fissure she hadn't even noticed. He picked up her sledgehammer, testing its weight. It looked like a child's toy in his grip. With a smooth, powerful swing that seemed to originate from the earth itself, he struck the rock. Not with brute force, but with precision. The head of the hammer hit the fissure with a sharp crack, and a large, flat slab of sandstone sheared away from the face landing with a heavy thud. Alina stared, speechless. She had hammered on that spot for hours with no result. Noah set the sledgehammer down. He looked at her, and for the first time his expression held something other than stoic neutrality. It was a flicker of something. Understanding, perhaps. "You have a spring," he said, his voice a low rumble. He pointed toward a dense thicket of cottonwood trees and willows in a low-lying part of her property, a patch of green she had assumed was just due to a dip in the land. "Water. That's why the trees grow here. It's close to the surface." Water was life. Water meant this land wasn't worthless at all. It was a secret treasure. I didn't know," she stammered. He looked back at the clearing, at the stone he had dislodged. "You're building a house." It wasn't a question. "I'm trying to," she admitted, the futility of it all washing over her again. "I don't know how." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. He seemed to be weighing a decision of great importance. Finally, he looked at her directly. "I know how." Hope, sharp and painful, lanced through her. "I have no money to pay you," she said, quickly, the words tumbling out. "The land is all I have. But there's water. And I can cook. I can mend clothes. I'll give you a share of every meal I can." She trailed off, feeling foolish. What could she possibly offer a man like him? He looked at her meager campsite, then back at her. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair was escaping its bun in frizzy strands, and her hands were a wreck. But her eyes were fierce with a desperate determination he recognized. "Food and a place to make my camp," he said simply. "I will help you build your house." It was a bargain struck in the dust, a partnership born of shared necessity and unspoken understanding. Noah unpacked his mule, setting up his own small, efficient camp near the spring. The arrangement was immediate and pragmatic. There were no pleasantries, no wasted words. There was only the work, and the work was a revelation. To watch Noah was to watch an artist. He was not just a strong back, he was a master of his craft. He knew the language of stone and wood. He showed Alina how to read the grain of the rock, where to strike to make it yield. He taught her how to mix adobe, using the clay from the arroyo, strengthening it with straw. He felled trees with a frightening efficiency, his axe strokes precise and powerful, and then hewed the logs into straight, true beams. They worked from sunup to sundown, falling into a rhythm. Alina became his apprentice. She mixed the mud, hauled the smaller stones, stripped the bark from the logs. The work was still back-breaking, but it was no longer fruitless. For every ache in her muscles, she could see progress. a foundation of heavy flat stones laid so perfectly they needed almost no mortar. Low stone walls beginning to rise from the earth. Their communication was sparse, mostly revolving around the task at hand. More water for the mix. This beam here, watch your hands. Yet in their shared silence and labor, a strange intimacy grew. She learned the sound of his breathing, the slight grunt he made when lifting a particularly heavy stone. He learned the determined set of her jaw when a task was difficult, the small, satisfied sigh she gave when a wall was laid straight and true. News of their arrangement traveled back to Dust Devil Creek on the wind. A lone prospector passing by saw the giant Cherokee and the tall woman working together and carried the tale to the saloon. The town exploded with gossip, fueled by Martha Higgins's righteous indignation. It's a scandal. A disgrace, she declared, outside the church. A young unmarried woman, living out in the wilderness, with that savage. What must people think? Andrew Croft was incandescent with rage. It was a multi-layered insult. That the worthless land he had mocked her for owning was now the site of a defiant act of creation. That the woman he had publicly humiliated had found an ally. And worst of all, that this ally was the very man who had refused to bow to him. To Andrew, it wasn't just a house being built. It was a monument to his own fading authority. He rode out to the property one afternoon with his two cronies. They sat on their horses at a distance, watching. Alina's stomach clenched, but Noah didn't even seem to notice them. He continued setting a heavy foundation stone, his focus absolute. "Look at 'em, boss," one of the hands sneered. "Playin' house." "Shut up," Andrew snarled, his eyes fixed on the rising walls. The house was taking shape, solid and real. It wasn't some flimsy shack. It was being built of stone, built to last. It was being built with ceilings that would be high and doorways that would be wide. It was a house being made to fit her. The realization infuriated him. He spurred his horse forward, stopping just outside the worksite. "Foster," he yelled. "This is a foolish game you're playing. No one's going to buy this land from you, not with him on it. You're better off selling it now. My father might give you a few dollars for it out of pity." Alina straightened up her hands on her hips. Dust clung to her dress and face. She was tired and sore, but she was not the same woman who had fled the town hall in tears. "It's not for sale, Andrew," she said, her voice clear and steady. Andrew's gaze shifted to Noah. "And you? Once this shack is built, what then? You think you'll have a place here? This is white man's territory." Noah placed the last stone in the row, tamping it down. Only then did he rise to his full intimidating height and turn to face Andrew. He said nothing. He just looked at him, his dark eyes like chips of obsidian. In his silence, there was a challenge more profound than any threat. "This is my work. This is our ground. You are not welcome here." Frustrated and powerless against their silent unity, Andrew yanked his horse's reins. "You'll regret this." He spat, his voice tight with venom. "Both of you." He galloped away, his men following. Alina watched them go, her heart pounding. She looked at Noah. He was already turning back to the wall, selecting the next stone. The foundation was laid, but she knew with a certainty that chilled her despite the afternoon sun that the real storm was yet to come. As the stone walls rose, so did the whispers between Alina and Noah, the initial silence of their partnership born of caution, and the sheer effort of their labor, began to give way to something else. It started with small things, a shared look of satisfaction at a perfectly set lintel over a window frame, a quiet chuckle from Noah when Alina, wrestling with a stubborn piece of wood, muttered curses at it. One evening as they sat on opposite sides of the campfire, eating a simple stew of rabbit and wild roots, Alina found her voice. "Where did you learn to build like this?" she asked, breaking their comfortable silence. Noah stared into the flames for a long time before answering. "My father," he said. "He was a white man, a stonemason from Pennsylvania. He loved stone more than he loved people." Alina was surprised. She, like the rest of the town, had assumed he was full-blooded Cherokee. He traveled west, looking for work. Noah continued his voice, a low, thoughtful rumble. "He met my mother near the Great Smoky Mountains. She was Cherokee. She had been a girl on the Trail of Tears, walked it with her family. Most of them didn't survive. She came back, said the land of her people was the only place her spirit could rest." He paused, poking the fire with a stick. Sparks flew up into the velvet black sky. They weren't welcome. A white man with an Indian wife. An Indian woman who refused to stay in the territory they'd been forced into. They built a cabin far up in the hills. He taught me how to work with stone and wood. She taught me the old ways, the language, how to listen to the land. He fell silent, the story hanging in the air between them. Alina could picture it, a small boy learning two different worlds from the two people he loved. "What happened to them?" she asked softly. "Fever took my mother when I was 15, he said, his voice devoid of emotion, yet the loss was a palpable presence. "My father. He just drifted away after that. The stone wasn't enough for him anymore. I joined the army as a scout. Seemed better than starving. Alina's heart ached for the boy. He must have been left alone between two worlds that didn't fully claim him. She too knew what it was to be an outsider. Her reasons were shallow in comparison, a matter of inches, but the loneliness was the same. "My parents died of cholera," she found herself saying. "I was 14. I came to live with my aunt and uncle. They're good people, but their house was never home. It was always too small." She didn't just mean the doorways. Noah looked at her, his dark eyes holding hers across the fire. "A home should fit the one who lives there," he said. It was a simple statement, but it was everything. He understood. He was building this house for her, not just as a job, but with an innate understanding of what she needed. High ceilings that wouldn't bow her head. Wide doorways she could walk through with her shoulders back. A space built not to shame her, but to celebrate her. From that night on, the walls of their silence crumbled completely. They talked as they worked their stories, weaving together with the timber and stone. He spoke of his time as a scout in the war, the terrible things he had seen, the casual cruelty, and the unexpected kindness. She spoke of her childhood, of her love for books, a secret passion she'd never shared with anyone, and of the slow, grinding erosion of her confidence under the town's scornful gaze. They discovered they were more alike than they were different. Both were solitary by nature, yet yearned for connection. Both were fiercely independent, yet had been shaped by forces beyond their control. A deep and abiding respect grew between them, which was slowly, quietly blossoming into something more. Alina found herself watching the play of muscles in his back as he worked, the gentleness in his enormous hands as he helped her reset a stone. He found himself listening for the sound of her low, warm laughter, a rare and precious thing. Meanwhile, in Dust Devil Creek, Andrew Croft's fury was festering. His public humiliation, coupled with the defiant construction on the worthless plot of land, was more than his pride could bear. But it was his father, the shrewd and ruthless Bartholomew Croft, who provided the true motive for their escalating obsession. Bartholomew was a man who saw the world in acres and dollars. He had been quietly, patiently trying to acquire all the small, independent plots of land bordering his vast ranch for years. He knew something that very few people did. The whole region was slipping into a deep drought. The seasonal creeks were drying up earlier each year. His own wells were having to be dug deeper. One of his ranch hands, an old-timer who knew the land better than anyone had told him years ago about a hidden year-round spring on the old Finch property, the very spring Noah had found. In a drought, a reliable source of water wasn't just valuable. It was power. It was the key to controlling the entire valley. He could water his own herds while his competitors' cattle withered. He could sell water at exorbitant prices. That worthless 30 acres was in fact the most valuable piece of land for 50 miles. He had been waiting for old Sadie Finch to die so he could buy it for a pittance from whatever clueless heir inherited it. That tall, clumsy girl Bartholomew had roared at Andrew in his study. You let her get her hands on it, and now you've let her put a half-breed on it to build a fortress. What were you thinking, antagonizing her? How was I to know about the damn water? Andrew shot back, smarting from his father's rebuke. You don't get paid to know. You get paid to do what I tell you. Bartholomew slammed his fist on his oak desk. I want that land, Andrew. I don't care how you get it. Scare them off. Break them. Burn them out. Just get me the deed. Andrew, armed with his father's blessing and a burning need for revenge, began to escalate his campaign of harassment. It started small. One morning, Alina and Noah awoke to find their supply of flour and salt pork slashed open and dumped in the dirt. Another day, a crucial support beam they had spent 2 days hewing and setting was dislodged in the night, crashing down and destroying a section of the wall. Alina was frightened, but Noah was grimly resolute. He's a coyote, Noah said, his voice cold, snapping at the edges, afraid to face us. They rebuilt the wall stronger this time. Noah began sleeping with his old army rifle by his side, his senses on high alert. The atmosphere at the worksite, once filled with the promise of creation, was now tinged with the constant threat of destruction. The final straw came one evening at dusk. Alina was tending to her small vegetable patch near the spring, while Noah was on the roof, securing the main ridge beam. Suddenly the sound of a gunshot echoed through the small valley, followed by a sharp zing as a bullet ricocheted off a stone near her head. She screamed and dropped to the ground. From his vantage point on the roof, Noah saw 2 riders, Andrew's men, galloping away into the twilight. His face, silhouetted against the dying sun, became a mask of cold fury. He scrambled down the ladder in seconds, his rifle in his hand. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his hands hovering over her, his eyes scanning for any sign of injury. "No," she whispered, her body trembling. "No, I'm all right." He helped her up, his touch surprisingly gentle. He held onto her arm for a moment, longer than necessary, his jaw tight. The line had been crossed. This was no longer about harassment. This was an attempt on her life. "This ends now," Noah said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He looked at the house, its roof now open to the sky, its walls strong and solid. It was almost finished. It was their creation, a symbol of their defiance. And now it was a battleground. "What are we going to do?" Alina asked, her voice shaking. Noah looked from the house to the horizon, where the riders had disappeared. His hand tightened on his rifle. "We finish the roof," he said, his voice filled with a hard, unyielding resolve. "And then we prepare for the reckoning." The final week of building was a silent, frantic race against a gathering storm. The easy camaraderie between Alina and Noah was replaced by a tense, focused urgency. Every hammer blow, every saw stroke was a defiant answer to the gunshot that still echoed in their ears. They spoke little, communicating through shared glances and grim determination. They were no longer just building a home. They were fortifying a position. Noah worked with a furious energy, his movements precise and economical, wasting nothing. He showed Alina how to reinforce the window shutters from the inside with thick iron bars he'd had the foresight to purchase from her uncle weeks ago. They secured the heavy oak door with a crossbeam that would hold against a battering ram. The house conceived as a sanctuary was becoming a stronghold. As they laid the last of the wooden shingles on the roof, a profound sense of accomplishment settled over them, mingled with dread. The house was finished. From the outside, it was a thing of simple, rugged beauty. Built of the very stone and timber of the land it stood on, it looked as if it had grown there. The lines were clean and strong, the proportions generous. Inside the ceilings soared high above Alina's head. She could stand in the center of the main room, stretch her arms wide, and touch nothing. For the first time in her adult life, she felt not just accommodated, but celebrated. A tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Noah stood beside her in the cavernous main room, the late afternoon sun slanting through the new window panes. He saw the tear and understood its source. He had built this house with his hands, but he had built it from her dreams. "It's a good house," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "It's more than good, Noah," she whispered. "It's mine." The tender moment was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Not 2, but at least a dozen. Noah's face hardened. He grabbed his rifle from its place by the hearth. "Stay inside," he commanded. "Bar the door behind me." "I'm not hiding," Alina said, her chin lifting. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a bedrock of defiance. She had helped build this house. She would help defend it. She picked up the heavy sledgehammer she had once been unable to wield effectively. It felt balanced in her hands, now an extension of her own newfound strength. Noah looked at her, at the formidable woman standing tall and resolute, and a flicker of a proud smile touched his lips. He gave a single sharp nod. They stepped out onto the wide porch together, just as the riders crested the rise. Bartholomew Croft led the charge, his face a thundercloud of arrogant authority. Andrew rode at his side, a triumphant smirk on his face. Behind them were a dozen hard-faced ranch hands, all armed. Bringing up the rear, looking deeply uncomfortable, was the town sheriff, a paunchy, indecisive man named Sheriff Miller. "This is your last chance." Foster Bartholomew Croft boomed, his voice accustomed to being obeyed. "The charade is over. I have a legal deed to this land, signed and sealed. You are trespassers." He held up a piece of paper. "That's a lie." Alina's voice rang out clear and strong, with no trace of the timid woman she had been. "This land was willed to me by my great-aunt. The deed is filed in the territorial office. A clerical error," Andrew sneered. "One that has been corrected. Sheriff Miller is here to enforce our rightful claim." All eyes turned to the sheriff, who shifted nervously in his saddle. "Now, folks, let's not have any trouble," he began weakly. "The trouble is already here." Sheriff Noah said, his voice cutting through the tension. He stood unmoving on the porch, his rifle held loosely at his side, yet his presence was more commanding than all of Croft's armed men combined. "You know what they've been doing. You know that bullet wasn't a warning." Sheriff Miller paled, avoiding Noah's gaze. "Enough of this!" Bartholomew roared, losing his patience. "You have 1 minute to leave this property, or my men will remove you. By force." The ranch hands fanned out their hands, moving to their holsters. The air grew thick with the promise of violence. Alina's heart hammered against her ribs, but she stood her ground beside Noah. They were 2 people against a small army. It was hopeless. And then the twist that no one saw coming arrived. Sheriff Miller cleared his throat, his voice suddenly louder, firmer. "Hold on, Bartholomew." Croft turned incredulous. "What did you say, Miller?" I said, "Hold on." The sheriff dismounted his movements, slow but deliberate. He walked towards the porch, not looking at the Crofts, but at Noah. Noah, he said, his voice filled with a strange mix of shame and gratitude. I haven't forgotten, Shiloh. A confused murmur went through the ranch hands. Andrew and Bartholomew exchanged a baffled look. Noah's expression didn't change, but a flicker of recognition showed in his eyes. Miller turned to face the assembled crowd. April 1862. The Battle of Shiloh. I was a scared lieutenant from Ohio, pinned down in a thicket, bleeding out. My whole company was dead or gone. A Confederate patrol was coming to finish me off. He paused, taking a deep breath. And then he appeared. A Union scout. Big as a damn mountain. He took out 2 of them before they knew what hit them and dragged me half a mile back to the field hospital. He saved my life. He looked directly at Noah. I never got your name, but I never forgot your face. He then turned his steely gaze on Bartholomew Croft, and I owe him a debt. So I did some looking into this clerical error of yours. I sent a wire to the territorial capital 2 days ago. Got a response this morning. The sheriff reached into his own coat and pulled out a telegram. Funny thing, the registrar's office has no record of your deed, Bartholomew, but they do have a record of a $50 payment made to a deputy registrar from an account belonging to the Croft Cattle Company. They call that bribery. The silence that followed was absolute. Bartholomew Croft's face went from red to a pasty white. Andrew looked as if he'd been poleaxed. Furthermore, Sheriff Miller continued, his voice ringing with newfound authority. I found the 2 men you sent out here the other night. They got drunk and chatty at the saloon. Confessed to everything. The vandalism, the shooting. They're cooling their heels in my jail cell right now, ready to testify that you and your son here put them up to it. The sheriff drew his pistol. It was no longer the weapon of a weak man. It was the instrument of the law. Bartholomew Croft, Andrew Croft, he declared, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. You are both under arrest for conspiracy, attempted murder, and fraud. Chaos erupted. 2 of the ranch hands, realizing their paymaster's power had just evaporated, spurred their horses, and fled. The others looked at each other, confused and leaderless. Bartholomew, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, made a fatal mistake. No milksop sheriff is arresting me, he bellowed, reaching for the pistol at his own hip. He never cleared the leather. Noah's rifle was up in a flash. He didn't fire at Croft. He fired at the ground just in front of his horse. The deafening blast and the spray of dirt sent the animal rearing in panic. Bartholomew screamed as he was thrown from the saddle landing in an undignified heap in the dust. Andrew, seeing his father fall and the sheriff's gun now pointed squarely at his chest, lost all his bravado. He raised his hands in surrender, his face a pale, sweating mask of terror. The reckoning had come, not with a bloody shootout, but with the quiet, unassailable weight of the truth. As Sheriff Miller and his one remaining loyal deputy, disarmed and bound, the once mighty Crofts, the townspeople who had followed at a distance, began to creep closer. They had come for the spectacle of a showdown. Instead, they were witnessing the fall of tyrants. They saw the beautiful solid house. They saw the tall woman Alina Foster, standing on her porch, not with a man to protect her, but with a partner beside her. They saw the giant Cherokee, not as a savage, but as an honorable man to whom their own sheriff owed his life. In that moment, everything changed. The whispers of mockery died, replaced by murmurs of awe and respect. Martha Higgins, watching from the back of the crowd, clutched her shawl, and for the first time in her life had absolutely nothing to say. Alina looked at Noah, the sledgehammer still resting in her hand, the rifle smoke still dissipating from his. They had faced the storm and had not broken. On the porch of the house they had built together, they had found their victory. The aftermath of the Crofts' arrest settled over Dust Devil Creek like a long overdue rain, washing the town clean of its fear and ingrained deference. The Croft empire, built on intimidation and fraud, crumbled overnight. Bartholomew's trial was swift, his crimes laid bare for all to see. With his influence gone, people who had been wronged by him for years came forward with their own stories. The court sentenced him and Andrew to a long stretch in the territorial prison at Yuma. Their vast ranch was broken up and sold off to pay their debts and fines its power to strangle the valley gone forever. Sheriff Miller became a new man, walking with a straight back and the quiet confidence of someone who had finally done the right thing. He was re-elected in a landslide that autumn. But for Alina and Noah, the town's drama was a distant echo. Their world was the 30 acres of rock and scrub that had become a sanctuary. The house stood proud and complete, its stone walls glowing golden in the morning sun, its high roof a bold line against the blue Arizona sky. In the quiet days that followed the confrontation, a new kind of silence settled between them. It wasn't the silence of strangers or the focused silence of labor. It was a comfortable knowing quiet, filled with unspoken things that shimmered in the air between them. They had been partners in creation and allies in a battle. Now they were simply two people in a home that fit them both perfectly. One evening they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mesas in hues of purple and orange. Alina had furnished the house simply with pieces she'd built herself from leftover timber, her hands now as skilled with a saw as they were with a kneading trough. "They talk about you in town, you know," Alina said softly, breaking the silence. Noah continued to gaze at the horizon. "What do they say now?" "They don't call you the Cherokee giant anymore. They call you Noah Wolfe, the man who faced down the Crofts, the man who saved the sheriff. Some of them are afraid of you, but most are respectful. And you?" he asked, turning to look at her. His dark eyes were serious, searching. "What do you call me?" Alina looked at his large, calloused hands resting on the porch rail, the hands that had quarried stone and hewn timber, the hands that had held a rifle to defend her. But she also thought of those same hands, gently checking a wall for level or patiently showing her how to notch a log. "I call you my friend," she said, her voice full of a sincerity that went deeper than words. "My partner." She paused, her heart beating a little faster. "My home." A slow, genuine smile spread across Noah's face, transforming his rugged features. It was a rare sight, and it made Alina's breath catch in her throat. He reached out his large hand, gently covering hers on the railing. His touch was warm and solid, a silent confirmation of everything they had built, both inside the house and out. It wasn't a whirlwind romance born of stolen glances at a dance. It was something far deeper, something grown slowly in the earth, like one of the sturdy cottonwoods by the spring. It was a love built on a foundation of mutual respect, mortared with shared hardship, and roofed with a quiet, profound understanding. He didn't see a woman who was too tall. He saw a woman strong enough to stand her ground, and she didn't see a savage or a giant. She saw a man with a quiet spirit and a creator's soul. Months turned into a year. The spring on their land, as Bartholomew Croft had known, proved to be a lifeline for the region, as the drought worsened. But Alina and Noah didn't hoard it. They shared it, allowing their neighbors to water their small herds for a fair price, cementing their place, not as outsiders, but as the new, quiet center of a more honest community. They married in the autumn, not in the town church, with Martha Higgins's judgmental eyes on them, but on the porch of their own house, with Sheriff Miller as their witness. Alina wore a simple blue dress and stood tall, her shoulders back, her face radiant with a happiness she had never believed possible. Noah stood beside her, his presence a quiet promise of steadfastness and strength. They didn't just build a house with their hands. They built a life. They carved out a space in a harsh and unforgiving world and made it their own. The woman they mocked for being too tall for a wife, and the Cherokee giant they feared as an intruder, had found in each other the one thing neither had ever had a place to truly belong. And their home, built of stone and timber, hand and heart, stood as a lasting monument to the fact that true worth is never measured by how well you fit into the world, but by the courage it takes to build your own. That's the story of Alina Foster and Noah Wolfe, a testament from the Old West that our greatest perceived weaknesses can become the bedrock of our greatest strengths. It's a reminder that true partnership isn't about finding someone who fits a mold, but finding someone who helps you build a space big enough for your own soul. They didn't just raise a roof, they raised each other up, proving that love and respect can build a fortress that no amount of mockery or greed can tear down. If this story of resilience, defiance, and unlikely love resonated with you, please give this video a like to help us share it with others. Share it with someone who appreciates a story where the underdogs don't just win, they build a whole new world. And most importantly, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you won't miss our next story from the dusty pages of history. Thanks for listening.